They laughed when Earl Dotson raised his paddle for $60 in the back of that auction barn in Breathitt County, Kentucky on the first Friday of March 2017. By the time he left that afternoon, nobody in the room was laughing. The auctioneer, a man named Bill Stroud, who had been calling sales in eastern Kentucky since 1984, and had heard most things, paused for just a second when the paddle went up. Not long. Just long enough for the two men standing near the lot to exchange a look. One of them shook his head. The other smiled the kind of smile you smile when someone else's mistake is small enough to be entertaining without being your problem. $60 for a rusted D-bolt floor safe with no combination, a frozen handle, and 30-odd years of sitting in a barn on the back of someone's property outside of Jackson, Kentucky, soaking up whatever moisture eastern Kentucky had to offer across those years, which was considerable. There's something about a person who doesn't have to prove anything. If you know what I mean, you'll know why this story is worth your time. Hit subscribe and stay with us. Earl Dotson was 54 years old that March. He had come to the Breathitt County farm auction that Friday alone, driving his Dodge Ram 2500 from his place in Clayhole, which was about 22 miles northwest of Jackson, on a two-lane road that followed the North Fork of the Kentucky River. He had brought a thermos of coffee and a composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind, with a rubber band around it. He had looked at the auction catalog the night before and circled 3 lots. The safe was not one of them. He had seen it when he was walking the floor before bidding started. The way he always walked the floor before bidding started. Slow and twice through. It was sitting in the far corner of the barn near the back wall, under a hanging fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered and cast everything around it in an uncertain color. A D-bolt floor model, one of the older configurations, squat and wide rather than tall and narrow, standing about 27 inches at the top. The manufacturer's badge on the front had gone to brown rust in a way that mostly obscured the model designation. The dial face was intact, but seized. The paint, or what had been paint, had oxidized to a gray-orange that told you the surface underneath was not doing well. Earl had crouched in front of it for about 8 minutes. He opened his notebook and wrote 3 lines in it. He didn't measure anything or use any tools. He looked at the dial housing. He looked at the body seam where the door met the frame on the hinge side. He pressed 2 fingers to the lower front corner and tapped once, listening. Then he stood, put the notebook back in his jacket, and walked toward the coffee urn near the front of the barn to refill his thermos. He did not circle the safe in his catalog. He knew what he was looking at. He had known within the first 90 seconds. The Breathitt County auction that day had drawn 160, maybe 170 people. This was a Friday sale, a weekday, which thinned the recreational bidders and left mostly the working buyers, the people who came because they needed something specific, or because they had built enough of a habit that they came every time regardless. The crowd had money in it, but it was careful money. Breathitt County is not a wealthy county. It is the kind of place where a man who shows up to an auction with a composition notebook and no companion gets sized up quietly by the people around him, and sized up again when he starts walking the lots. Earl Dotson was not famous in Breathitt County, not wealthy, just known, which is a different thing entirely, and in some ways more valuable. He had farmed tobacco and beef cattle on his family's land in Clayhole for most of his adult life. The farm had come to him from his father, which had come from his grandfather before that, and it sat on about 240 acres of mostly ridge and hollow ground that was good for cattle if you managed it right, and difficult for most everything else. He ran about 80 head of Angus, leased another 60 acres to a neighbor for hay, and kept his operation lean enough that in most years the numbers worked. He had a particular gift for machinery. Not the formal kind. He'd never had more than one semester of vocational school. But the deep intuitive kind that comes from spending 40 years keeping old iron running because you can't afford to replace it. John Deere. Case A 1979 Massey Ferguson 265 that he had rebuilt the injection pump on twice himself, once with parts from a catalog, and once with a part he'd machined at a shop in Hazard because the catalog part was back-ordered 6 weeks. That kind of knowledge doesn't advertise itself. Earl Dotson didn't advertise himself. What he knew about safes specifically had come from one person, which was his uncle Clarence, who had died in the spring of 2009 after spending 41 years working maintenance and building services for the First Eastern Savings Network across 3 counties in eastern Kentucky. Clarence had worked on everything: vac systems, boiler rooms, electrical panels, fire suppression. But his particular specialty, the thing he'd ended up doing more than anything else, because nobody else wanted to learn it and somebody had to know it, was the older vault and safe equipment the bank had inherited through branch acquisitions going back to the 1950s. Diebold's, Mosler's, Hall's, the occasional Herring Hall Marvin. Units that had been bolted into branch floors before some of the branch towns had paved roads, and were still bolted there because removing them was expensive, and the bank had never gotten around to having a reason. Clarence kept records the way certain kinds of careful men keep records, not because anyone asked him to, but because the information seemed worth having. He had a 3-ring binder for each manufacturer, the pages in plastic sleeves, with production-era notes and interior configuration details and the known quirks of each model family going back as far as he could trace. He had added to them across 4 decades. When he retired in 2001, he took the binders with him. When he died in 2009, he had no children and no spouse, and his estate was simple enough that most of it went to his sister, who was Earl's mother. Earl's mother gave him the binders because she didn't know what else to do with them, and Earl had always been the one Clarence would talk to at family gatherings about the kind of things Clarence talked about, which were technical and specific, and not widely interesting. Earl had read every page of those binders. He'd read them over the course of about 6 months after his mother handed them to him, evenings after the farm work was done. And he'd flagged the sections that were new to him with sticky notes that he replaced once he'd learned what was on them. He was not trying to become a safe technician. He just didn't like not understanding things that could be understood. What Clarence's binder for Diebold contained, specifically what it said about floor-safe models manufactured at the Diebold plant in Canton, Ohio during the late 1950s and early 1960s, was this: a substantial portion of those units, particularly those sold to rural branch banks and credit unions in Appalachian markets, came configured with a feature that Clarence called the secondary ledger cavity. It was not a hidden compartment in the way people mean when they say hidden. It was a recessed tray, about 3 inches deep and 1.5 feet wide, mounted to the interior bottom plate below the lowest visible shelf, accessible by removing the shelf and a false bottom panel beneath it. The feature had been a selling point to small banks that wanted to store overnight deposit records separately from the main vault contents. It appeared in the catalog specifications for a specific Diebold model family. Clarence had the model numbers written out, and then disappeared from specifications sometime around 1964. Apparently because the design was simplified to cut manufacturing costs. Most owners of those units didn't know the tray was there. Most of them had never removed the lower shelf. The shelf fit snugly enough that it didn't rattle, and unless you knew to look, there was no visible indication from the interior that there was anything beneath it. Clarence had found that tray in 7 different units across his career. In 4 of them, it was empty. In two of them, it contained old ledger pages and microfiche reels that the bank had forgotten during a records migration. In one of them, a unit at a small branch in Letcher County that had been closed and the building sold in the early 1990s, it contained an envelope with $480 in currency and a handwritten list of deposit box numbers that turned out to be relevant to a probate case somebody had been trying to resolve for 11 years. Clarence had noted all of this in the binder, in his careful handwriting, in black ballpoint pen. Earl Dotson had read those pages 3 times. When he crouched in front of the Diebold in that Breathitt County auction barn and looked at the dial housing and the hinge seam and the body dimensions and tapped the lower front corner, he was doing what Clarence had described, reading the exterior for what it could tell you about when and where the unit had been made. The dial type was right. The body gauge was right. The hinge configuration matched the description for the model family. He was not certain. You couldn't be certain without opening it, but he was close enough to it that he wrote in his notebook what he wrote and walked away to get more coffee. The Diebold came up in the middle of the afternoon, after the cattle and before the last of the small equipment. The room had thinned slightly by then. Some of the early buyers had loaded and left, and the energy that builds in the first 2 hours of a sale had settled into the patient, slightly tired rhythm of the back half. Bill Stroud described it in 8 words: old floor safe, as is, no combination, buyer removes. He opened at $25. The room declined. He went to $15. The man standing nearest to the safe, a heavy-set farmer from up near Boonville named Harlan Webb, who had bought 3 lots already that day and was running out of patience, looked at it for about 2 seconds and turned away. Bill Stroud asked for 10. Earl raised his paddle. The 2 men who had exchanged looks earlier were still standing near the south wall. One of them said something low to the other. Earl didn't catch the words. He understood the tone fine. Bill Stroud, who had been calling sales in eastern Kentucky since 1984 and had long since stopped reacting to what the room thought about individual bids, kept his face professionally neutral. He asked for 15. The room didn't answer. He asked for $12.50 in the way auctioneers ask for a number they don't expect to get, just to show they tried. Nothing. He looked at Earl. Earl didn't move his paddle, which in the language of auctions means I am satisfied where I am. Stroud confirmed 10, asked once more for $12.50 as a formality, and then looked at the room generally in case someone wanted to come in late. Harlan Webb from Boonville shook his head without anyone asking him anything. Someone near the equipment rose. Earl thought it might have been Coy Burchett, though he wasn't certain, made a small sound. Not mocking, not quite. The sound a man makes when the number on the board doesn't add up to him, and he's not invested enough to say so out loud. Bill Stroud asked for 60 as the final standing bid. Earl confirmed 60. Stroud brought the gavel down, and that was the end of it. Earl signed the ticket at the table near the entrance, handed the estate assistant his card for removal logistics, and went to find his truck. He did not explain anything to anyone. There was nothing to explain yet. A man had bid $60 on a rusted Diebold floor safe in a county auction barn in eastern Kentucky. That was all that had happened so far. He did not have a locksmith lined up. What he had instead was a man named Prentice Gall, who lived about 11 miles east of Clayhole off a gravel road, and who had spent 23 years as a machinist at a tool and die operation in Hazard before the company shut down, and who, in his retirement, would help a neighbor with unusual mechanical problems if the neighbor asked, and the problem interested him. Earl had called Prentice from the parking lot of the auction barn on his way to the truck. He explained what he had and what he needed. Prentice said he'd meet him at Earl's shop the following morning. It took 2 of Earl's farmhands and a furniture dolly and a piece of 3/4-inch plywood under the barn door to get the Diebold into the truck bed without destroying anything. They drove it to Clayhole that evening and set it in Earl's equipment barn next to a Case H8240 combine header he'd been working on since November. Prentice Gall arrived the next morning at 8:15 with a canvas tool roll and a cup of coffee from his own thermos. He looked at the safe for about 5 minutes before he said anything. He said the dial was seized at the mechanism, not the dial face, which was a different problem than it looked like, and probably a more solvable one. He worked on it for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Earl stood nearby for the first hour, asking occasional questions, and then went to feed the cattle and came back. When he came back, Prentice was sitting in a folding chair looking at the safe door, which was open. The interior looked, at first, like nothing. The lower shelf was intact. The upper shelf was intact. The document tray on the left wall was empty. Earl thanked Prentice and asked if he could look around in it for a minute. Prentice refilled his coffee from the thermos and said, "Take your time." Earl removed the lower shelf. It came out in 2 pieces, a front section and a rear section, which was the configuration Clarence had described. Beneath it was a panel that fit snugly to the floor of the safe. There was no handle. There was a small slot near the rear edge, maybe a 1/4 inch wide. Earl used a flat blade screwdriver, and the panel lifted on a piano hinge and folded back. The secondary ledger cavity held 2 items. The first was a bundle of United States Series EE savings bonds, held together with a rubber band that had partly deteriorated. 14 bonds in total, issued between 1981 and 1987, face values ranging from $50 to $200 each. Earl counted them on the workbench, wrote the face values in his composition notebook, and called the Treasury Department's bond information line from his phone while Prentice watched. The bonds had matured. Series EE bonds from that era, held to maturity, doubled in face value. The current redemption value for the bundle, calculated from the face amounts and the maturation terms, came to $3,840. The second item was a metal cash box, the kind with a small lock, and the lock was not engaged. Inside it was $820 in currency, a mixture of 10s, 20s, and 2 $50 bills, and a small index card with 2 names and 2 phone numbers written on it in pencil. The names meant nothing to Earl. He kept the number of the estate attorney and passed the card to her the following week, in case it meant something to the family. He redeemed the bonds through his bank in Jackson over the course of the next 6 weeks, which was the pace the bank recommended for paperwork purposes. The total redemption, when the last of them cleared, was $3,840 as calculated. Combined with the currency, the interior of that $60 safe returned $4,660. He told Prentice about the numbers later, on a Saturday in May when they crossed paths at a hardware store in Boonville. Prentice said he was glad the morning had been worth Earl's time. Earl said it had been. Prentice asked what the bonds came to in total. Earl told him. Prentice made no particular expression and said that seemed like a fair return on a Friday. Earl agreed. That was the end of the conversation. Neither of them is particularly interested in discussing their own business at any greater length than the facts require. Word got around Breathitt County the way it gets around everywhere, not through any announcement but through the natural movement of information between people who attend the same sales and stop at the same hardware stores and see each other in the same feed supply parking lots. By late spring, most of the regulars at Alderman Auction Hall knew something about what Earl had found, though the versions varied and the numbers in circulation were not always accurate. Harlan Webb from Boonville heard it from his wife's cousin in June. He didn't say much when he heard it. He had nothing in particular to say. Earl Dotson still farms his 240 acres in Clayhole. Still runs the Angus. About 80 head now, same as before. The 1979 Massey Ferguson 265 finally gave out the year after the auction. The engine block cracked in the fall, which Prentice looked at and said was not worth repairing at the cost the repair would take. And Earl replaced it with a 1991 Case IH 5130 he found at a farm estate sale in Magoffin County for $4,200, which he said was a fair price for what it was. He still attends 4 or 5 auctions a year. He still walks the floor twice before bidding opens. He still brings the composition notebook. Clarence's binders are in a waterproof plastic tote in the back room of Earl's equipment shop, where they stay dry and flat, and where he can get to them in 20 seconds if something at a sale warrants checking. He has shown them to 2 people in the years since. Prentice, who read the Diebold section and said Clarence had clearly been a meticulous man, and his youngest son, who is 28 and farms with him part-time, and who Earl says is starting to pay attention. He has not found another secondary ledger cavity since that Friday in 2017. He has looked. Not every Diebold at auction is the right model family, and most of the ones that fit the description have been opened sometime in the past 20 years by someone who either found the tray or didn't notice it was there. The world runs out of specific things to find. That's the part of this story Earl would want you to understand clearly, if you were to ask him, which most people don't. He was not certain when he raised his paddle. He had a reasonable belief based on what Clarence had written and what he'd been able to see, and he had $60 he could afford to be wrong with. He happened to be right. He knows that those are 2 different things. A man named Coy Burchett was standing near the south wall of the barn when Earl raised his paddle. Coy ran a small equipment repair operation out of Quicksand and had known Earl Dotson casually for about 15 years, the way people know each other in a county that size, without being particularly close. He said afterward that he'd watched Earl walk that Diebold twice before bidding opened, and he'd wondered about it. Wondered what Earl was looking for, but hadn't asked because that's not how you do it at auction. You don't ask a man what he sees. Coy said he thought about it later, though. He thought about it for a while. He said the thing that stayed with him was not the money. He didn't know about the money for months, but the way Earl had walked. Slow. Twice through, writing in that notebook like he was the only person in the barn who thought anything on that floor was worth studying. Coy said he'd started walking lots a little slower after that. Started looking at things a little longer. He didn't say it had changed his life. He just said it seemed like the more patient approach. Clarence Dotson had kept those binders for 41 years because the information in them seemed worth keeping. Not because anyone was ever going to give him anything for it. Not because he expected it to matter to anyone after he was gone. He just thought careful knowledge deserved to be written down. His nephew read every page. And on a cold Friday in March, in a barn in Breathitt County, it turned out that was enough.